In this video, we are going to implement some default instructions in a Dialog script. Now, I've started an interview from a test assembly of this separation agreement. You can see in the client information dialog, I've already filled out some basic client information, specifically the name, street address, city, state, and zip. Now, if I move quickly to the spouse information dialog, you'll notice that there are analogous variables or questions there for the spouse's name, address, city, state, and zip. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get into this spouse information dialog, and because I started this interview by way of the test assemble button on the HotDocs ribbon, I can right click on the dialog here in the interview outline and select edit component. Of course, an alternative way to access the dialog editor for this spouse information dialog is to do so through Component Manager. I'm going to click on the Script tab, and I am going to implement a default instruction, and I'm going to start out by using the spouse street address 1 variable. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a default variable to expression model from this instruction models list into the script box. And I'm going to default, as you can see here by way of the placeholders, a certain variable to a certain value. Expression here is kind of a catch-all term for some sort of value. I am going to drag the spouse street address 1 variable, and I'm going to drop it on that variable placeholder. Now, if I wanted to default this particular text variable to some sort of text value, some hard-coded text value, I could use the enter some text model here, simply by dragging it up, dropping it on the expression, and then type in some text. But what I really want to do here is default the spouse street address 1 variable to whatever the value of the client street address variable is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my filter here to all components, and then I'm going to go up into the client variables here, and I'm going to grab the client street address 1 variable. I'm going to drop it on that expression placeholder. So using the drag and drop method, I could repeat this process and implement default instructions for the address to city, state, and zip variables. But in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and type this out. We recommend, especially when you're first getting familiar with putting together scripts, whether they're dialog scripts or computation scripts, that you use a drag and drop method, because that drag and drop method will ensure that all of the script is syntactically correct. But as you get more familiar with models and putting these different models together, using them with each other, you might find it quicker and easier to go through and type these instructions out. So I'm going to do the same thing for the street address 2 variable here. 2 needs to be in all caps. And then I'll go ahead and repeat this process for the spouse city variable. Defaulting it to whatever the value of the client city variable is. Do the same thing for the spouse state. And then finally for the spouse zip, I'm going to default that to the client zip variable. Okay, so I have 5 default instructions now in this dialog script, defaulting all of the spouse address variables to whatever the values of the client address variables are. You'll see right now they're blank, but if I were to click on update here so that HotDocs processes this new script, you'll notice that these spouse address variables have as their default values or answers the same values or answers that I entered in the client information dialog. Now, these are just default responses. If at some point I wanted to come in and make a change to any one of these, I could certainly do so. Default instructions just provide initial values for unanswered questions. So if these questions had already been answered, either previously in the interview or by way of an answer file, then those default instructions would effectively be ignored, and HotDocs wouldn't overwrite anything that's already in there with whatever the default value otherwise would be. It's only in the situation where the question is unanswered that HotDocs would provide that initial answer or value by way of the default. One last thing with regard to default instructions, there are some special rules for using default instructions in repeat style dialogues. So I'm just going to jump over here to the Properties tab quickly. You can see that this is set up as a regular style dialog, or in other words, a non-repeating dialog. So using default instructions in a dialog script for a regular or non-repeating dialog doesn't present much of a problem or issue, but there are some special rules that you need to be aware of. They are discussed at length in the HotDocs help file when using default instructions in repeat dialogues. But otherwise, you can use default instructions to take some of the burden of the interview off the end user and provide some default responses to questions that might be answered in certain ways.